Hey, and welcome to the One Mission, One Movement podcast, where we believe God has one mission on his mind to reach the lost and one movement on this planet, the Church of Jesus Christ. In the midst of a pandemic, we're left wondering how we'll ever find the new normal. Well, in this two-part series, Wayman and Steve will discuss how the church can survive and thrive despite change. Thanks for joining us, and let's dive in.
Hey, I'm Wayman Ming Jr., and this is Steve Throckmorton, and we want to welcome you to our One Mission, One Movement podcast, where we're talking about Steve pursuing his presence, contending for mission, and growing the church.
Yes, and we're going to continue today with growing the church, and we're going to talk about changing church as usual. And so I think we can all learn from this, the current milieu in which we're in right now.
Well, it's a very interesting topic, especially with where we are in our culture with COVID-19 and the idea of social distancing and all that's transpiring. I mean, how do we even talk about growing the church in the midst of a pandemic?
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons we're shifting kind of the emphasis to say, well, maybe we need to make some changes. We're having to make some changes, but this is a good time for us to reflect. So that's really kind of what we're talking about today, changing church as usual. And Wayman, let me ask you the obvious question. What do you believe that God is saying to us? What is God doing during this time?
I've been sensing that God is doing something extraordinary during this particular moment. In fact, what if God is changing the church paradigm during this particular moment? What if he's doing something? Of course, the title of the podcast, Changing Church as Usual. What if he is moving us toward this understanding he's trying to change the church? He's trying to create something that is fresh and new coming out of COVID-19. I feel like he is. In fact, the secret's out.
Right.
Before COVID-19,
I know
we were in warp speed, and our schedules, everything about our lives, were so busy that what if we lost our daily pursuit of God?
Right.
And in the midst of this, God is now attracting us back to himself, and he is trying to teach us that this is not about church activities or church as usual, but a passionate pursuit of him in our daily lives.
It's amazing. None of us saw COVID-19 coming, so it was like, but we were talking essentially about the fact that we were too busy, we were too distracted, life was too fast-paced, and that our priorities had really kind of gotten out of balance. And so then, as we were working our way through these early episodes, then here we are in which everything just comes to a stop. It wasn't just that we slowed down, but there was just a complete readjustment was necessary. And I feel exactly the way that you feel about this. I feel like that this is this has been a great opportunity for the church to rethink things. And we believed that for a long time. Pam and I, as we've been working, church as usual became problematic for us many years ago. And so this has been a time to kind of revisit a lot of those questions and make sure that we're moving in a direction the Lord wants us to move, and we're not on autopilot.
That's a good observation. I look at what's happened or transpired over the last several weeks, and it looks like the church is trying to adapt to the sequester.
Right.
We're winning in the air, I would say.
That's a good point.
The airways are being filled with the gospel. We're touching, millions, if not billions, of homes through the airways. The gospel, even worship on Facebook Live and live video streaming is happening. But I guess my question is, if we're doing well in the air, what happens to the ground game?
Right.
Because the kingdom is all about relationship. It's about relationship with God, loving the Lord our God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving one another as ourselves. So even in the midst of a great air game, how do we navigate through the ground game? In fact, let me just ask the question, what if the internet went down?
Right.
What if we lost 5G or 4G?
Yeah.
Where would we be? What is the response to that?
No, that's true. And again, we're on the ground every day, and so that became the growing issue. And in the beginning, we weren't sure. Was it going to be 2 weeks? Was it going to be 4 weeks? And then we began to realize it was pretty clear that, that this was going to be an ongoing situation. And so then it really in the light of what we've been talking about, being missional, being intentional, and I think our church and I think our movement, we've been gearing up, for this missional push, and we've really been seeking to engage. And so when this came, then that I know our church, and I know in my leadership, in the beginning, it was kind of we had to just kind of step back and stop for just a moment. And then, but then we recognized that, Jesus, God came to us in human form, and he walked on the earth, and Jesus' ministry was in this interactive ground game. I mean, it's the ultimate ground game, where God comes and really rolls up his sleeves and really gets involved. And so one of the things that we've been looking at there, one of the things we've been trying to balance is how to be socially responsible, how to honor the authorities and those things, but at the same time to realize that, we answer to a higher authority as well, and our mission is, and so that's going to face the church. The church now is going to face some really more challenging, more difficult situations with that. So, so we can explore some answers on that today. But the question's real.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into that today, because I think there's some meat there that we need to talk about, and it's important to explore what the church is going to look like in the midst of social distancing and social media, because as church facilities begin opening up, it's even going to look different in terms of how we gather collectively. People will be paranoid at some level to come back to church gatherings, or they will be passive because they can stay at home and watch their favorite worship service online, while they're involved in multiple projects. In fact, I was laughing the other day because I found myself on Sunday watching 4 different services online. I kept flipping back and forth to 4 different worship services, 4 different messages, while I was engaged in about 2 or 3 projects at the same time, honey-do list at home. So that's par for the course. And the church will have to navigate through, now what do we do with that?
Right. Yeah, that was pretty typical experience, I think, for a lot of people. I know that we, from a pastoral point of view, I mean, I was involved every Sunday morning with, the challenges of how are we going to reach people? What are we going to do? How are we going to do this safely? How are we going to be in compliance? All the different sorts of things. And so we kind of went through that odyssey that a lot of pastors did. We had been doing Facebook Live ever since, we had been in our church there. And so we've been active in engaging outside of the 4 walls, doing that and trying to have a presence and, a stronger online presence, website, different sorts of things there, and really kind of bringing an older church into kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And so, and then church as usual was something that we realized had not been working at the particular place where we started pastoring about 3 years ago. And so we were involved in a lot of those in a lot of those different ways. But for me, on Sunday mornings, remotely, we had part of our worship team there, so we were under 10, and so we had praise and worship, and then we had a time of teaching, and then we transitioned to an outdoor service because our people were like, we want to get together,
Yeah.
we want to see each other.
Sure.
Church is not, you don't ultimately do church remotely. I mean, it's very difficult to do church remotely long term because fellowship is so important and the connection to the body. So we started doing that. One of the great things that came out of that is we went to like a drive-in or a drive-up service, and we got outside. We literally got outside the four walls of the church, and our people were like, "Wow, why don't we do this more often?" That's a big thing on the ground, to make sure that we're providing a safe environment for people, and then I think passivity. That's it's important for us to continue to provide opportunities outside of that, but we've got to keep people focused on being involved. Yeah.
Well, let's talk specifically about a couple of 2 or 3 items that would encourage churches today to continue to accelerate their missional pace, continue to grow. Obviously, the air game is not going to go away, and it can become very effective for us as we reach out. I heard a story just this week about a church that over the last few weeks has seen more people come to Christ through conversion, committing their lives to Christ as they've done the services, live video streaming, than actually in the context of their corporate gathering. So there are benefits, and we're not talking about necessarily not continuing to see these elements to go forth. But I do have a passionate concern or a passionate challenge that I would like to dive deeper into with you.
And let's talk about that. I know that as we've been kind of discussing this and looking at it. You've talked about some, I think, important ideas and transitions, that focuses that we need to have that can be helpful during the time. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I really feel like for a church to grow, that there needs to be a more vital emphasis on becoming a house of prayer.
Yes.
Living as a house of prayer. Mark 11:17 is a great word from Jesus as he said, my house will be called a house of prayer for the nations. And I think as we come out of this COVID-19 experience and we once again see church gatherings happening, and we're confronted with church as usual, one of the changes that we really need to see happen is more emphasis on living as a house of prayer. Because even before COVID-19 occurred, at least in the United States church, we had become very focused on what happens inside the walls of the church. And I know that when I talk about living as a house of prayer, some leaders, some pastors may be threatened by that. And because in many ways, some of our services have become more houses of preaching and houses of praise, which there's nothing wrong with preaching and praise. We want to encourage that. But what would happen if we brought more balance to the church as we progress out of COVID-19? And it's not just about preaching, and it's not just about praise or gathering together and experiencing one form, or one model, which is music.
Yeah. No.
I mean, what if we spent just as much time on our knees and on our faces as we did on our feet?
Right.
In praise? What if we decided to live as a house of prayer, even in our collective gatherings? And we could talk more about what that might look like as well.
I think that's good. I like what you're saying there. I think church in terms of our congregational meetings, in terms of that, it's been like a one-way street, and it's like praise and worship is kind of geared and aimed towards people, and they certainly come in and kind of participate in that, but we take the lead in that, and then preaching has definitely traditionally been a one-way street.
Sure,
it's been something really it's been troubling to me for a long time, and so I think part of what this situation is forcing pastors like me to step back and say, listen, we've got to rethink this, and how can people be more involved and more interactive in that. So I definitely like that idea, of prayer, and then creating a conversation with our congregations and with our people, and really open that up during, and this can be a time for us to become more conversational, more interactive.
That's it.
And we really live in an interactive age, and the younger generation, their lives is full of all kinds of interactions in different directions, and so they think kind of outside the box on that. And so but I was thinking, when you're talking about the house of prayer, I was thinking about, COVID-19, is a situation, we run into these catastrophes, or we run into these difficult situations that drive people to their knees. You ask what drives people to their knees, or what brings them to their knees. And so I think a lot of people are praying more during this time, because we're facing this threat and different things. But then the big question is that what keeps people on their knees? What keeps them in the posture of prayer? I think people are praying more, but then once the crisis passes, we kind of get out of that. And so as we were talking about that, and as I was kind of previewing this and kind of looking at this, it made sense to me to say, what's going to keep us on our knees? And it's relationship. It's what we were saying, is pursuing God and developing that relationship, coming back to God every day, not just in the crisis, but coming back every day to develop that conversation, not only between ourselves, but with the Lord. And prayer becomes that life-sustaining conversation that we have, and that one relationship in the midst of crisis, or in the midst when things are going well, that's really going to sustain us. So that's what we've been trying to cultivate, as an attitude in a prayer.
Yeah, I think that's important, because right now we're seeing that happen with the sequester. People are being attracted to daily devotion with God, to rhythms of prayer in their personal lives and in their families.
Yes.
And we don't want to lose that moment. We want to capture that moment. And as the collective body of Christ begins to come together again, I think there's some specific ways to cultivate that.
Yes, talk about that.
I've heard of some churches already planning to have prayer stations, maybe a communion station located in the auditorium or sanctuary, so during the worship time, people can go and take communion as a family or as an individual, and so it becomes more interactive and reflective of prayer. I'm also hearing about churches having stations to anoint people with oil or pray specifically over them. So not just engaging in singing during worship, but having opportunities for prayer for people and with people. And then, of course, I think there's always other options to engage in as well. Why not have prayer stations to pray for the lost, where you can go and pray for revival or awakening, or the personal conversion of your family members, or neighborhoods or cities, so that people are engaging more in times of prayer while they're coming together. Of course, we're not going to be able to fit as many people into our auditoriums and sanctuaries, so we're going to have more room, I believe, to develop some of these types of collective prayer gatherings where people can focus on prayer. And so we're cultivating that, and we're encouraging that, and pastors, perhaps as they're even preaching, are able to become a little bit more conversational, where they're having different ones read scripture and maybe discuss it again because of the smaller gatherings of people. There's lots that we can do to live as a house of prayer, collectively and corporately.
No, there really is. One of the interesting things that happened to us last year is in the wake of our centennial celebration, which was amazing. Some of the breakout sessions, we went to one of the breakout sessions with ministers from the Philippines, and they talked about kind of the way in which they had grown churches from 200 to 2,000 to 5. Just seen this tremendous growth, and they talked about the prayer of three and how that everything began by three people coming together, and then they began to pray for 5 to 7 people that they knew with that. And so we went home and we took that strategy. And so Pam and I, my wife and I, and our church delegate, we were there for those meetings. And so when we came home, that's what we decided to do. And we started that just a prayer of three, just a circle of that. We began to pray for all those things, revival, for awakening. We began to pray for the lost that we knew. We began to pray for people in our church. And we saw tremendous breakthrough. By that fall, we saw breakthrough in terms of our growth. We saw breakthrough in terms of the finances. We saw breakthrough in terms of people's personal lives. And so we personally experienced that, what you're talking about. And I know that there are other strategies kind of that you've talked about as well.
I love that strategy because I think you can use the biblical model of 3, 12, 70, 120, where every church should be able to identify 3 intercessors who might be able to join in praying for revival in the church and awakening in our culture. Pastors, out of 100 people, I believe, should be able to identify at least 5 intercessors out of every 100. So, developing those layers of prayer, 3, 12, 70, 120, and using that model to really birth living as a house of prayer for the nations, I think is important. And I know we have to move quickly to the second area for church growth. And I just want to mention that, of course, my love for alliteration. So
right.
We have, if our churches are going to grow, we need to live as a house of prayer. I would say second, if our churches are going to grow, we need to live as people who care.
Yes.
And I think that's critical, that we care for people.
Yeah, you'd mentioned, I think we were talking about, we're dealing with a situation where we're fighting an infection, and so you'd mentioned about how caring was infectious itself. And I think, and it's these fundamental things, I think, that it's important for us in the church. We get caught up in the how, sometimes we lose the what, so we're wondering how, but I think we need to revisit that what, and I think we need to say, our caring is a fundamental, and so, are we expressing during this time? Are we getting back to those fundamentals of caring, loving, compassion, and making a difference in people's lives? So.
Well, here's what I'm seeing, and I know you're seeing it as well as a pastor, that with the sequester at home, all kinds of suppressed dysfunction in our families and homes, all of that is rising to the surface. And now you're seeing major marital strife, depression, suicide, financial despair, everything that was ignored because of the warp speed lives that we were living has now emerged in this sequester, where if it was a problem that was being suppressed, now it's come to the surface, so that people, they're not just experiencing life-altering devastation with the loss of loved ones or friends during COVID-19, but now they're experiencing the devastation of all of this. And so as a church, if we're going to grow, we're going to have to be able to care for people through the midst of these life-altering moments.
Yes, that's good. And when we first went to the church where we're at now, that's part. We went, and it was a church that at one time run at about 150, about 200 people. And when we went, there were about 12 people left in the church. And so we came into that situation, and so we immediately realized that church as usual wasn't working. And so I told him, I said, if we come here, we're not going to do business as usual. We're not going to do church as usual. We're going to be church outside the four walls. We're going to do that. And I said, I don't know what's been done here. I don't know what's been tried here. I don't know what's going on, but it obviously hasn't worked. And if you don't believe it, just look around. I mean, it's just 12 people. And so we were in the process of kind of rethinking that. And then what we realized, though, is that we were surrounded in the county where I live with tremendous darkness. We're surrounded by drugs and domestic violence, child abuse, and those are predominant problems. And so to make a difference, then we realized that, those people aren't going to show up at church. Those are not the people that are seeking you out. And so we began to think about ways to make that change. And one of the things that I did is I felt like the Lord led me to go to people, and I would ask the question. I would ask them if they knew, I didn't ask them if they went to church or any of that. I asked them if they had a pastor. The Lord just said, because there's a passage in Matthew where Jesus is looking out at the crowds, and they're harassed, and they're helpless, and they're hurting, and Jesus he's moved with compassion towards them, and he says, "Pray, the harvest is ripe." But the Lord was telling, they were like sheep without a shepherd, and so the Lord was telling me that, you're shepherding more than just these 12 people. You're shepherding people in your community. And so I just went to people, and I would ask them, I would say, "Do you have a pastor?" And they would look at me like, "Well, no, I don't have a pastor."
Right.
So I'd hand him a card, and I said, "I want to be your pastor." Everybody needs a pastor sometime. Everybody's going to need this. And so I'm not expecting you to come to our church. I'm not expecting anything other than if you need me, call me. If you need us, call us. And we're going to be there for you no matter what. And great things came out of that. And as we move along, I may talk a little bit more about that. But we had situations come up, and we realized that we were already transitioning as pastors. We were already transitioning outside of that paradigm. We were already saying, I pastor this community, and I pastor the unchurched. And so that was that. And so then the big thing was that, they're going to know if you care, but if you care, you're going to get out there and make a difference. Yeah.
And churches that are going to grow as we transition out of or through COVID-19 are going to be those churches, right? The churches that care. And I've seen it, you've seen it through the pandemic. Whenever disasters and pandemics occur, you have the doomers and gloomers, right, that end up talking about the punitive nature of God.
Yes. That
he's judging us, he's disciplining us, he's chastising us, and that's a deeper conversation. But I would just simply say the churches that are going to grow as we address church as usual are going to be the ones who drop the rocks.
Right.
And they leave the rocks in the streets. And they love people, and they care for people. Viruses are contagious, but so is care. Compassion, right, and caring for people is contagious.
Yes.
And people, just like you're sharing, I want to be your pastor because I care.
Right.
People coming out of paranoia, fear, devastation, they need somebody. They need some churches,
right,
that will be prepared.
Yeah.
To care.
To care and to make that, to make that difference in their lives. So that's true. It's great. It's powerful. Yeah.
Well, I think God is helping us with perhaps understanding His heart and His perspective through the midst of growing the church. I know we're going to talk about that more in the next episode. And as we bring this episode to a close, of course, we love the idea that when your mission is clear, your decisions are simple. And so, Steve, take us home here. If you could give one word of advice, one decision that could be made to those who are listening by Google or Apple or Spotify, maybe those who are watching us on our PCG, We Are PCG video YouTube page, what would that be? What would the one decision be for you coming out of this episode that would help our listeners and our viewers?
Right. Well, I think one of the important things to realize is the connection between prayer and care. And I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about sharing our faith, but start with prayer. And what I always tell people is take that first step. There's a proverb from the East that says a journey of 1,000 miles, begins with the first step. And so take that first step and focus upon, from a pastoral point of view in your own life, prayer and renewing prayer and making sure that that's happening, and then creating opportunities for prayer. And then for Christians, I think it's a matter of praying. It's a matter of continuing that and realizing that, as we said earlier, prayer really develops that relationship with God. When you pray for people, you get close to the heart of God. And when you get close to the heart of God, you care. And then that's the motivation, the Holy Spirit in prayer, always fanning the flames of our passion to do what the Lord wants us to do. And it's that conversation with the Lord. So I would say pray, and then pray some more. And then if you want to, pray a little bit more, to do that. So yeah, that's a good place to start. I
love that. And, we talked about that as well in the last episode, that oftentimes sharing our faith begins with praying for someone. And it's that initial prayer that burdens our heart. I love the idea that who we really are as Christians is not who we are in public before people. Who we really are as Christians are who we are in our prayer closet before God. And that really becomes the launching pad for changing church as usual.
Yes.
And so I've enjoyed this episode, Steve.
Yeah.
We need to close it out the right way.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
One mission,
one movement,
all to Him.
Thank you for listening to the One Mission, One Movement podcast. This podcast is sponsored by the Pentecostal Church of God, which is a body of believers in nearly 70 nations around the world. So we certainly invite you to join the movement by visiting our website at pcg.org. But more importantly, we want to inspire you to pursue God's presence, contend for mission, and grow the church. So if you liked today's episode and you're excited about more to come, we'll be dropping new episodes bi-monthly. So be sure to like, share, and click the subscribe button for more updates. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.